Greetings, everyone. I'm Sandeepan, Director at the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, or FAS, as we are more commonly known as. And on behalf of FAS, I'm very pleased today to welcome you all on this 8th seminar of the 3rd round of the Young Scholars Seminars online seminar series. This seminar series is a platform for young scholars working in the field of agrarian studies and generally on socio-economic life in rural India. They come here and present their work in front of peers, experts, and other eminent scholars, receive feedback. And this is also a part of our consistent effort to engage and to try and build a research community around agrarian studies. Over the past few sessions, we have heard presentations on a wide range of topics, ranging from agrarian relations, wage rates and earnings, labor absorption, gender, technology, and environment. Today's seminar, titled Agrarian Change and Accumulation in Central India, Revisiting the Agrarian Question of Capital, will be presented by Dr. Sunit Arora, Assistant Professor of Economics at the Azim Premji University, Bhopal campus. Welcome, Sunit. Sunit takes a political economy approach to this topic, and there are obvious convergences with the work that we do at the foundation as part of our village studies program. Under this program, we have, as some of you would know, we have already surveyed 27 villages in 12 states in the country. Sunit's work is based on Central India, and it revisits the relevance of agrarian question in the global South and explores how capital accumulation within agriculture reshapes agrarian relations. Let me also welcome our discussant for today, Dr. Soham Bhattacharya, a postdoctoral researcher at the Mutturi Satyanarayana Center for Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Sciences, Kriya University. Soham is a long-standing collaborator of the foundation, and we are very glad to have him with us today. Let me also reach out and say that both of them, both Soham and Sunit, belong to a research community that is very close to FAS's own research. And I can only hope that this seminar series is somehow contributing in expanding that research community. I would also like to welcome Professor Barbara Harris-White, Emeritus Professor of Development Studies at the University of Oxford, who is also the chair of this seminar series. But before I hand it over to Professor Barbara, let me make an announcement on behalf of FAS. I'm very happy to share that we will be hosting an international conference on agrarian change in the month of November, from 6th to 9th November 2025 in Thiruvananthapuram in the state of Kerala. The conference website is now live. We will share the link at the chat box, and I will request, you can see the conference website on your screen. Please take a moment to read through the website. The conference aims to take stock of current thinking and scholarship on rural change, and there are 4 focus areas: productive forces and relations of production in the countryside, the role of modern science and technology in advancing agriculture, poverty and standards of living in rural areas, and the impact of climate change on agriculture and rural development. Of course, we also have, we plan to, and we have already announced a call for papers, and the deadline for the submission is, there's still time, it's June 30th, but we hope that many of our young scholars from this seminar series would also consider applying. We look forward to your contributions. With this, let me thank you all once again and invite Professor Barbara to take over. Professor Barbara.
Thank you very much, Sandeepan. Can everybody hear me from Oxford? Yes, is it okay?
Yes.
Good. I'm delighted to chair the seminar series in general, and this one, which is very close to my own interests. All I have to do, since Sandeepan has so ably introduced the speaker and the discussant, is to welcome you, to welcome the audience, to say that Sunit is invited to speak for roughly 30 minutes on your subject, and that Soham will discuss for up to 10. Is that okay? After which there will be Q&A. And all of you in the audience, please put your questions in the chat, and my job as chair will be to try to order them in a way that makes a nice discussion afterwards. Okay, without more ado, we're all eager to learn about the agrarian question of capital and your site in central India. So over to you, Sunit.
Thank you, Professor Harris-White. Should I share my screen now?
Yes, please.
I'm Sunit. I teach economics at Azim Premji University. This research is coming from my PhD thesis, which I did under the supervision of Professor Deepak Mishra at the Center for the Study of Regional Development in JNU. At the outset, I would like to thank the Foundation for Agrarian Studies for giving me this opportunity to discuss my work. I'm grateful to the entire staff of FAS for making this seminar series possible. I'm also immensely grateful to Professor Harris-White for engaging with my work. It is indeed an honor. Also, a word of thanks to everyone who's taken out the time to join this session online, and for those of you who will be watching it later on. So in this paper, I try to revisit the agrarian question of capital and provide evidence of dynamism in agriculture based on empirical inquiry. The regional agrarian scene is actually characterized by differences in speed as well as trajectories of agrarian development, and this necessitates revisiting the question of capital, which in the contemporary context we can think of as dealing with primarily two things. First, the process of accumulation within agriculture, and second, accumulating agrarian classes who accumulate based on their hold in agriculture. So what I do in this paper is to map the trajectory of agrarian change in a central Indian region, rather than working on a general understanding of agrarian change at the national level. And through this work, then I try to argue that it is possible to think of regional structures of accumulation under agrarian development, wherein agrarian capital plays a significant role. And thus, we can also argue for the relevance of the agrarian question of capital at a regional scale in India. My study site is based in the state of Madhya Pradesh. Now, Madhya Pradesh has been identified as a backward state in terms of social and economic indicators. However, every year when there's news flash about bumper wheat crops and public procurement of wheat, we have heard of Madhya Pradesh topping the charts in the last 1 decade. Now, parts of the state have shown tremendous agricultural growth, and that is why the newsflash. And this is the part that I'm trying to study in my research. It is the part lying in southern part of Madhya Pradesh, which is irrigated by canals from Narmada and its tributaries. It began in 1974 with the first reservoir coming in place on River Tawa, which is a tributary of Narmada. If we see the region now, it is serviced by extensive network of canals, which has resulted into possibility of double and triple cropping. This region now, the southern part of Madhya Pradesh, now counts as the largest wheat producing regions in the country. The cultivation process is highly mechanized and the yields are significantly higher than the state average. Lying on the east-west as well as north-south corridor, it is well connected by railways and road network, which means that this has translated into easier access for inputs and agricultural markets, but also some sort of non-farm employment opportunities. What I do in this paper, for the quantitative data, I rely on the census survey of a village that I took from this region, a typical village of this region. And the survey was conducted in the agricultural year 2018-19. However, all other observations pertaining to agrarian relations, cropping patterns, etc., are broadly drawn from the region itself. So Avli is a typical village of the region. It is situated near the southern bank of River Narmada. It is neither too remote nor in the municipal limits of any large city. There are 294 households which were residing in the village in 2018-19, and I surveyed all 294 of them. Avli has good road connectivity. It is situated also close to the state highway, which means there is relatively easier access to certain large commercial centers, including the state capital. For the classification of households, I've broadly followed the methodology used by the Foundation of Agrarian Studies scholars in their field studies, which means that I've used multiple descriptive criteria rather than an index to classify the households into classes. Now, I will not have the time to go into the details of these classes or the criteria, but what I'll do is I'll show you a snapshot of the distribution of how these classes are distributed in the 294 households resident in the village of Ambli. This is a table which gives the classification by the classes, but I've also mentioned the broad social groups just to get some sense of how the households are distributed. With this background set, what I'm going to do in the rest of the paper is talk about 3 primary drivers of accumulation in the region and back it up with empirical data from Ambli. The first driver that I'm going to talk about is land ownership. Now, numerous village studies, including the PARI studies as well as National Sample Survey data, have talked about inequality in access to land in rural India. My work from Ambli also brings out this inequality. So there are around 66% of the village households own agricultural land, but the ownership is highly unequal. Just to get a sense broadly from this table, if you look at the average size ownership of the landlords in rural capitalist households, that's around 17 times that of a poor peasant household on average. And if you look at the last column, which is the access index, which is simply speaking the ratio of share of a particular class in land ownership to its share in household number, the population, you find that barring the poor peasant households, all other cultivating classes have higher access to land. But this also means that poor peasants, which actually make up the largest cultivating class, around 17% of the village households, own much less land than their share in population. Similarly, if we talk about landlessness, around 34% households own no agricultural land. And the landlessness is closely mirrored by the social disparities. So we find that all ST households and a large chunk of the SC households own no agricultural land, whereas in terms of Rajput households, out of 85 households, only 1 is landless. So this village is largely Rajput and Yadav dominated, and Rajputs are the traditional landed landed social group. Now, this kind of inequality in access to land obviously has implications for agricultural production and incomes, but also for access to formal sector credit. So I did another small exercise as part of this work. What I did was to map the village lands on the base of their market price. And then I segregated the most expensive land in the village, which is around 10% of the total land. This is the land which lies adjacent to the state highway. And this land was selling for around 25 lakhs per acre as compared to the plots in the interior, which were sold for 9 to 10 lakhs per acre. It is important to note that the difference in the price is not coming because of irrigation facilities. So the access to canal remains the same whether the land is near the state highway or in the interior. Then this difference is basically coming from the potential commercial use of the land lying adjacent to the state highway. In fact, when I spoke to the owners of the land, almost everyone had identified some alternative use of the land. Even though they were using it for cultivation, they were thinking of things like selling it to some other real estate market, or constructing large warehouses, even petrol pumps. In the last 15 years, in all the transactions involving this most expensive land in the village, the buyers have been large landlords and rural capitalist households from within the village. Now, this is an interesting finding because usually we think that real estate players from bigger cities will come in and buy the land which is adjacent to the highway and then use it for different kinds of construction purposes. What I find is that this land, the first point of sale, the buyer is from the village itself, who in turn is then looking for different uses of this land. Obviously, they're also going to then either use it for they're going to become either part of some real estate project or in turn sell it to somebody else. So if you look at the distribution of this land, the ownership is largely in the hands of landlords and rural capitalist farmers. And in the last 15 years, as I mentioned, all the land which has been sold from this category has been brought by these households. So there is increasing concentration of the most expensive land, which obviously becomes an important driver of accumulation, but also links these households to real estate markets. And through these land market deals, we find that the local agrarian capital comes in contact with the national market and also in contact with finance capital. The second thing that I want to talk about is the accumulation driven by the change in cropping pattern itself. Before I get into what were these exact changes and how they came about, I just want to quickly talk about these two very interesting quotes from my respondents. The first one, this owner of a Rajput household says that his father used to own 24 acres of land, but cultivated coarse grain. And even to meet their everyday needs used to be a challenge. But with the advent of canal irrigation, things changed. And if you look at the last line, he refers to Narmada as Mother Narmada. So in this region, River Narmada is actually worshipped as a goddess. This second one is from another resident who who told me, looking at his house made with premium tiles and intricate wooden panels, and he was very proudly telling that this house was built on account of soybean. And he says that if they had not started cultivating soybean, they would not have been able to afford such a nice house. So to briefly sketch the timeline of how the changes have come about, so till about 1970s, this region was a single cropping season with very small quantities of wheat, but largely coarse grains which were cultivated. In the early 1970s, began the construction of dams and reservoirs on Narmada and its tributaries. The first large dam to come in this region was on River Tawa. With this began the expansion in wheat production because canal irrigation started being released, canal water started being released for the fields in this region. Around the mid-70s, soybean was introduced by the state government as a new cash crop to increase potential agricultural income. Now, with the coming of soybean, a major change happened, which is that the land became double cropped. So there was wheat followed by soybean. Over the last 2 decades, over the next 2 decades, soybean and wheat played an important role in increasing and augmenting agricultural income. And that is what ties to the quote by the resident who talks about his house. It is important to note that soybean was not part of the local consumption cycle in any way. It was just made for export purposes, right? Wheat, though, slowly starts becoming the staple crop of the region. So if you visit the region now, you will find that wheat is the staple grain which is eaten here. It has replaced the coarse grains which were cultivated earlier. However, since the 2000s, we also find that there has been a decline in soybean, in the yields and also in the area. Now, this decline has come about primarily for 2 reasons. One, that the soil has become resistant to soybean, to the diseases of soybean, and therefore you need to apply more chemical fertilizers and pesticides. So that has increased the cost of cultivation. The second thing is uncertainty in monsoon. So the year immediately after I finished my survey, there was a sudden downpour, which led to standing crop loss. And the year after that, there was a delay in monsoon, so the yields had declined by a lot. So this has meant that soybean is showing very low returns. Now, with the decline of soybean, we've also seen the emergence of a very interesting crop in this region, which is paddy. It is important to know that paddy was not traditionally cultivated in this region. And how it comes to be cultivated is actually a very interesting story. So it has come with the in-migration of farmers from Punjab who came to central India in search of newer and cheaper lands. And as the farmers came to settle down in this region, in central parts of India, with them they brought the technical know-how of how to cultivate paddy and the capability of investing in alternative irrigation mechanisms. So paddy cultivation basically requires some sort of alternative irrigation mechanism. You can't depend on just the monsoon, and also some initial investment in preparing the land. Once a household has done that, they can then in turn use the same irrigation mechanism to actually take a third summer crop, which is a short 60-day variety of moong dal, a very common pulse consumed in India. So what has happened now is there is wheat crop followed by a short-term summer crop of 60 days, then immediately followed by paddy or soybean, right? This is how the cropping pattern looks like. So the change has taken place from a single annual crop to 3 crops in a year. During the survey year, I found that wheat was cultivated by all the cultivating households, and it had nearly 100% of the operational holdings were cultivating wheat. The yields in the study region were around 1900 kgs per acre, which is much higher than the state average of 1350 kgs per acre. And these yields are actually very closer to what Punjab and Haryana have been giving for some years. Also, it is important to note that even though wheat is a staple dietary product, it is not that households grow wheat for self-consumption purposes. Broadly, it is grown for market exchange, right? And in this exchange, public procurement plays a very important role, with state government being the largest buyer. Now, considerations of marketability and profit margins have actually changed this region into there's a fixed system of monocropping now, which is fixed in the region, right? Wheat in the Rabi season, followed by moong, followed by paddy and kharif. It is also interesting to look at the incomes from these crops. So I will not go into the details of the mechanism of cost of cultivation, but I will just take your attention to the last column in the table. If you look at the net incomes, you can see that wheat is obviously the most remunerative crop, closely followed by paddy. For moong, please keep in mind that the time is just 2 months, exactly half of wheat and paddy. So that return is actually quite high. And soybean is showing near zero returns. This obviously means that a move towards or a switch towards these crops of paddy and moong would significantly augment the potential income. But I find a systematic variation when I look across different cultivating classes. I find that it is landlords, rural capitalists, and rich peasants who have broadly made this switch, right? So who have basically used this switch to augment their potential incomes. And the poor peasant households are still cultivating soybean. Now, this is obviously coming from their lack to obviously fund the switch to paddy and also take the risk involved in moving to a new crop. So this is the cropping change pattern as it looks today in the region. Now, obviously, this has made agriculture very fast-paced because if you take 3 crops in a year, back to back, there is no time for any kind of delay. This also means that all major agricultural operations are now carried out with the help of machines across different size classes of operational holdings. So even if you look at a 2-acre holding, operational holding, it is not as if that the owner will use manual labor. We found that expenditure on machine labor is significantly higher than expenditure on manual labor. It made up around 20% of the total cost of cultivation for all the major crops. Now, when you have such fast-paced agriculture, the dependence on rented machine actually can lead to, is considered to be very risky, as it can lead to crop losses. Any delay in getting a machine on rent can lead to crop losses. Also, at the same time, buying machines like tractors and harvesters is a huge risk, both monetarily and operationally. So what I found was something very interesting. So I found that there were 9 combined harvesters in the village of Avni. Now, combined harvesters are a novelty in central India, right? So it is only in the last decade or so that people have started investing in these kind of agricultural machines. So we found that there were 9 harvesters owned by 4 households. All of these households had some similar characteristics. One was that they belonged to the landlords and rural capitalist class. Second, they had some alternative income stream. For example, one of them had a salaried member. 2 of them had large tracts of land, around 60 acres of land. And all households had 3 or more adult sons. Now, these adult sons or the male members of the family are actually so there are 2 things why they're buying machines. One is to find employment opportunities for their adult sons, but also because if they have adult sons, they can use these machines to actually generate a rental income stream, right? So because buying these machines is expensive, obviously households are not buying it only for their own use. They're also looking at it in terms of trying to generate some additional income stream. The distribution of agricultural assets was highly unequal, obviously because these machines are expensive and not all the households had the capacity to afford them. If you look at some of the numbers, the average ownership of agricultural assets for the rural capitalist and landlord households was around 12.5 lakhs, whereas poor peasant households owned around 27,000 rupees worth of agricultural assets on average. Now, there is extensive mechanization in the region. There's also extreme asymmetry in ownership of agricultural assets. These 2 things together have translated into a thriving rental market for agricultural machines. So there is a possibility of earning rental incomes from agricultural machines. Now, this has been a common phenomenon in northern states, right? For central India, this is something new. This is a new phenomenon when you're trying to extract rent using your investments in agricultural machinery. If you go back to the quote of the person whose father used to own 24 acres, and then they started cultivating wheat once once canal irrigation became possible, that same person is Ajit Rajput. He now owns 12 acres because his father's 24 acres was split in two. Half went to his brother and half he owns. Now what he's done is he owns 12 acres of land, but he's dabbled in agricultural machinery. He now rents out tractors, multiple tractors and combine harvesters. And he's made himself a comfortable income stream based on his reinvestment of the money that he got from wheat and soybean production into buying tractors early on in mid 1980s. Now, investments in agricultural inputs allow these households to earn additional incomes, but they also place them firmly in the circuits of rental market. As these machines move in search of new pieces of agricultural land, they transcend the boundaries of states and forge new networks, somewhat similar to the agrarian capital from the states of Punjab and Haryana. This is how the village of Ambi actually gets linked to the world outside. So for decades, we have had harvesters coming from Punjab into this region and also to the village itself. They've come from Punjab, the agrarian capital from Punjab has come here in the form of these machines. And now the same process is being followed. The agrarian capital from here is now getting reinvested in these machines and then going beyond the borders of the state and crossing into Maharashtra and forward. So these are three primary drivers that I wanted to touch upon. First was the land ownership. Second was the change in cropping pattern itself. And third, the rental incomes coming from agricultural assets. All these three are intricately linked to each other and make up a story of agrarian change in this region, which stands out as some sort of evidence to tell us that there is agrarian capital, which remains important in this region. And the genesis of capital remains important and how it's moving across different classes and also across different activities. So I'm going to sum up by bringing out some of the main points from my from this paper, and then I'll be happy to take the comments, suggestions, questions, etc. So what I've tried to do by pointing out these three drivers of accumulation is to talk about possibilities, channels, and patterns of agrarian accumulation in an agriculturally advanced region lying in central India. I've tried to provide some empirical evidence of the dynamism in agriculture, as well as its spillover effects on non-agrarian accumulation dynamics, which we see through various kinds of investments that they make in buying machines, in buying better land for different purposes. The agrarian question of capital remains important at a regional scale in India. The genesis of agrarian capital retains significance, and its movement results in economic diversification. So studies like ours call for importance and focus to be brought back on the question of capital. And through this, I try to map the contemporary agrarian change processes as being linked to the generation of agrarian surplus. And I try to contribute to the debate on the relevance of the agrarian question of capital in the global south from this work. I'll stop here and I'll be happy to discuss this paper in detail with all of you.
Thank you very much, Sunit. That was a very rich empirical analysis. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of responses and questions. What was very interesting to me was the migration of capital, first via the Sikhs into the region, and then via machine rental markets out of the region. Yes. And so you can contribute to ideas about migration by looking at migration of capital as well as the bearers of capital, people. But anyway, without more ado, I want to turn it over to Soham, who has very similar research interests to you, for discussant's comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Barbara. Thank you, Sunit. I mean, it was absolutely, on some of the points that you've touched. Are very common and similar to Haryana and Punjab agriculture, but not so much discussed in the central Indian agrarian relations. I've sort of broken down the set of reflections to discuss in two parts. The first part is largely clarificatory, where I want to know more about what empirical evidence that you have brought from the field. The first thing to start off is, the composition of these particular two groups who are quite similar in their population, nature of their share in the population, that is your Yadavs and Rajputs, but entirely look at it. I mean, if the Yadavs population that I could see, that they're entirely over all the classes, while Rajputs are concentrated, on the upper rung of the peasantry, or maybe mostly in the rich capitalist and rich peasant section. So in within this local power structure that you're seeing to be changed, that the ownership of the most expensive land, the rental market being operated, agricultural asset market being operated by Rajputs. How is the local power structure, operating across these two groups, Yadavs and Rajputs? And if you can, I mean, in contrast to rest of the places where we observe the politics of, the local political dynamics of capital being contested. That's the first, I mean, from your empirical evidence. And the second, what I wanted your reflections on. So the 1970s Narmada, dam, and followed by that, that's a public investment led, sort of cropping pattern change, which is introducing soybean. And then 3 decades later, in the larger Indian trajectory, we have seen that post 2000, the public investment in Indian, the agriculture has been declining. And in here, what we are observing, you're faced with monsoon uncertainty, and soybean, I mean, with high temperature rise, soybean is declining, rice is being introduced. What is the nature of public investment? Does it, does it at all sort of interfere in the production over there, or is it just private capital investment that is started coming from Punjab and now being sort of co-opted by the local reach? I mean, if you would like to, reflect on these two first, because the next two are broadly theoretical, and I'm sure I just was going through the participants. Jens is here and others are also here. So maybe, Professor Barbara, with your permission, I'll come with the next two questions later.
Okay, that's fine. Sunit, would you like to reply to those two clarificatory questions?
Sure. So I'll start with the second one first about the public investment. Yes, so it is very crucial to note that public investment, though it was the propeller of the change in the beginning, it sort of started declining. However, there is a lot of pressure politically in this region. So a lot of our chief ministers and agricultural ministers of the state have come from southern MP. So there is a pressure on political pressure to actually invest in at least the irrigation part. So if you look at Mekhla Krishnamurthy's work, it is also located within the same region. And she studied the ethnography, she's done an ethnography of the wheat markets in Harda, which is also part of this region. So the public procurement process goes on very strongly. What has happened is, in terms of paddy, there is no public procurement because it's a new crop, so it's not procured by the state. So for paddy, people have to go to the market. So that then links it to uncertainty. But to compensate, or at least to make up for this, there is a new trend which has come about in the last 4 years, which is to release the canal water for also the summer crop. So people who don't have irrigation mechanisms and who were dependent only on wheat and soybean are now still, again, they're taking, even though they can't take paddy, they can at least take moong, right? So we find that wheat is the main thing which propels this. So usually you think of some commercial crop as being a non-food grain crop. But we find that with state support, even a food grain crop can actually act as something which can give a push to accumulation. And for the first part about Yadavs and Rajputs, there is a power tussle, obviously, because the numbers are very similar. And Rajputs have traditionally been landed, but Yadavs are politically stronger. So that sort of tussle plays out. I would like to bring your attention to another group which is very important, which is the Sahus. So they are smaller in number, but this is the traditional trading class, right? So they've actually managed to breach into that rural capitalist household class. So they started with small land ownerships. Now they have larger land ownerships. They are the most diversified groups in the region. They have used rental markets. They have used other businesses. This is somewhat similar to the Palanpur studies. So there they find Telis who do this, who actually have an upwardly mobile. So here you find Sahus rising in both in economic importance, but also social importance, because they are increasingly sort of diversifying in various fields and trying to occupy the important trades in the region.
Okay, back to you, Soham, for your
Thank you.
theoretical comments.
The next two are largely, I'm trying to locate this theoretically, where, what is the suggestion of the change in this cropping pattern, and because paddy is introduced through Punjab farmers and large wheat is your mechanized. So if I want to reflect now on the question of differentiation of peasantry, along with the choice of techniques. The earlier 1970s debate had a very strong component of labor ratio or usage of labor, where peasantry was getting differentiated by, you know, household, whether one is using their own labor or whether they are hiring labor. Now, all throughout your classes, the choice of technique is not, one is either owning the machine and or the others are renting it. So, is this something where we are observing that the choice of technique becoming similar, making the labor ratio a redundant thing for the differentiation? Where is the differentiation is coming from? The cost of cultivation rising because of renting the machines else from elsewhere. Yeah. So that's the second thing. And the last bit is, if such a thing is happening, and if your mechanization, as you have pointed out, is dependent on having an elder son who can take the machine to other places, those kind of mechanization is also gendered. We won't see a tractor or a combined harvester being sort of driven by women from the household. So what is the relation between then women and this kind of agrarian capital coming in? I mean, do women work in agriculture anymore, or yeah, they're just in sort of engaged in the social reproductive labor within the households? I'd like to know your reflections on these two. Thank you. That's all. I mean, I have only these two comments.
Thanks very much. Over to you, Sunit. And before you answer, could I please make an appeal for Q&A in the chat? I have no idea if there's a Q&A box on whether, wait a moment, no questions. Okay, so please put your questions in the chat. And over to you, Sunit, to answer those discussants' comments.
Thank you, Soham. These are very important questions. The first one I've been struggling with myself, as you already know. So when I started, my labor ratios were not falling in line. That was my first attempt, was to classify the households using labor ratios, but they were not falling in line due to two main reasons. One is increased dependence on mechanization, and second is this blurring of lines between farm and non-farm labor, right? So we need to do something to incorporate these two changes to make sense of the E ratios. Now, there has been some recent work by scholars working in Punjab who have come up with a modified index, right? However, I had done my work much before the index came, so I could not sort of use that to see if it was falling in line. What we do find is that if you need to have different criteria, because labor ratios often give confusing results, especially for the middle peasantry. So it becomes difficult then to depend just on labor ratio. That was the choice that I made because I thought this was not working very well. This second is the question on women in agrarian change. This is again a thing that I want to comprehensively work on. The questions that I picked up were looking at household ownership of assets. So most of my respondents then happened to be men. So even though that I would really love to do something more detailed, what I did notice during my conversations with women, aside from the questionnaire and other things, was one, there are two main roles that they're playing now. One is as a laborer in paddy transplantation, which remains the only activity which is manual labor intensive, right? So one is that. The second is their access is in terms of accessing credit through SHGs. So from that, women are trying to sort of get access to credit and then use it for different, either household reproduction or to start something at a small level for themselves, right? So these are two things which give me an hint as to that that there is a possibility of doing a study specifically focusing on women and how their role has changed with the capital intensification. But that I think is for the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Since I haven't had time to read them, I'm just going to go down from top to bottom. Marcus is kicking off. Thanks for the talk. Could you elaborate more fully what you understand by the agrarian question of capital. I had that question too. Does your research suggest that a new answer to the agrarian question of capital is emerging? So first define it and then say what your contribution is.
So should I answer now for this, or should we?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
So primarily two things. One is the possibility of accumulation within agriculture. And second, these new agrarian accumulating classes, which are accumulating based on their hold in agriculture. These are two components of which we can think of as the components of probably the contemporary agrarian question of capital. I would not go as forward as saying that I have an answer, but I would like to say that at least we need to rethink about the agrarian question of capital, and we cannot say, I think it's a time to go back to this question and see if we can actually find answers and have different trajectories coming about.
Thank you. The second one, I'm just looking down. There are two questions about other classes, which I'm going to hold for the moment. Judith is asking about links with urban area, manufacturing, non-agricultural activities. And again, I had a question to you about the context. And that's also a question about research design. You have the agrarian question of capital. Your research design, focuses on a single village. And Judith is asking, what about those links outside the village, apart from the migration links that you talked about during your talk? Was any of the agrarian capital being invested outside agriculture altogether? Yeah, can you answer that one? And then we'll go on to the other question.
I think this is a common question posed to all scholars studying one village, but I just wanted to say that so when I've tried to study AVLI, I've made sure that when I'm mapping the activities and mapping the movement of capital and also the movement of people, it is not limited only to the village. So in terms of connection with urban areas, I have a story of commuting rather than migration. So people, because of good physical road connectivity, you have the same set of people working in the fields during some part of the season, and then commuting to the nearby city to work in urban factories and shops as non-farm workers in other parts of the year. You also have different members from the same household doing this. So one member is working in the village fields, but the other member is working in the non-urban areas. We also have some sort of evidence for capital being invested in education and in education purposes, but it has not resulted in sort of getting a high level of reproduction back in the system or a high level of investment back in the system. It is not translated into the kind of jobs that people wanted to or were aspiring for. So the activity then remains linked to the rural sector or the farm sector.
Thank you. Gaurav has asked a similar question. I'm coming back to the other questions later. And you have started to explain about the regional economy, but he's asking how the expanded capital accumulation in agriculture contributes to broader development in and around the local region, and whether you have any evidence on the very interesting question of Henry Bernstein on the bypassing of the agrarian question of capital, or whether the agrarian question of capital remains relevant in the region. And what that is doing is inviting you also to talk about the agrarian question of labor, about which there are two more questions. But why don't we do Gaurav's question first?
So Bernstein, though he started out like he's done extensive, he has stated that the question has been bypassed, but in his 2015 work on China, he also talks about a set of questions which deal with the agrarian question. And in that, he has a question which pertains to the relations within the countryside. So I'm using that to sort of, there is some possibility of then revisiting the question. And we find evidence that it has not been bypassed, but it is also going hand in hand with the changes in the labor structure itself. So it's not just labor which is getting restructured, but also how agrarian capital is moving and transforming. So that makes the agrarian question of capital relevant in the current times.
And Jens wants you to defend yourself again, picking up on the agrarian question of capital, and suggests that what you're doing is looking at a restricted version of the agrarian question of capital, looking at accumulation by capitalist farmers. And as he says, it's an important finding, but something different from what Bernstein actually meant by the agrarian question of capital. How do you respond to this? Because it's coming up again and again.
So I would just say that I'm probably looking at the new ways in which the agrarian question of capital can now be defined in the contemporary times, and then linking it to the movement and genesis of agrarian capital and how it is not important for, say, at the national level. But if you look at regional specific trajectories, this capital remains important, and how it sort of plays about in its relation to the labor also.
It reminds me of Mann and Dickinson in the 1970s, their paper saying that there were physical reasons why there were ceilings to the possibility of investing capital inside agriculture itself, which is why the agrarian question has to be expanded. And what you seem to be contributing is saying that in the 21st century, with mechanization, the ceiling rises. Not that there isn't a physical ceiling to what you can do with land, but that with machines, the ceiling is rising so that capitalization proceeds apace. And what do you think are the next steps in the mechanization of agriculture? Do you have very precise irrigation and water management technology, other kinds of transportation and trucks and all that? What do you think they're doing other than investing in land that is actually agricultural investment?
Should I answer this now? Or
yes, please.
One is obviously investing in land, that is obvious. The second is also investing in this movement towards better crops. That's also in some sense investing in agriculture, but moving to a crop which is now. So basically, if you look at Scott's idea of this, how this change in crop is actually embodying intensification of capitalist development. So the move from soybean to paddy, or the move from coarse grains to wheat, is actually this embodiment of the capitalist intensification. So that is one larger thing. And the third thing is obviously investing in then buying agricultural machinery, but that is again both for their own use but also for rental incomes. So it takes care of the lines sort of blur for that investment. They want to prevent their own crop losses. They want to avoid the risk of renting in machines, but they also want to use that for an additional income stream.
Thanks. As far as I can see, there are a set of questions which are to do with labor and lower costs. But before we go on to that set of questions, Vasundhara asks a question which really boils down to, is the center of gravity of that portfolio of capitalist elite farmers moving away from agriculture? Can you answer that quite quickly, and we'll go on to the other body of questions?
So I don't see it as them moving away. So I don't see that accumulation as an exit from agriculture. I just see it as an accumulation based within their hold in agriculture. So they are expanding at the same time they're increasing their operational holdings. So it's not as if they're trying to abandon agriculture and go to something else. They're looking for ways to accumulate within agriculture by expanding holdings, by moving to crops, which will give them better returns. So definitely it's not a move away.
Thanks. I may not ask all the questions by name, but Anonymous kicked it off by asking about diversification amongst labor classes. Now, this is outside your very strict box of agrarian question of capital in the village, but so many of the people in the audience are interested in what the consequences are of these changes for other classes in the village. Judith asks about labor markets and also about migration of people in and out of the village. Others in the chat box have asked about low caste people and their role in the process of accumulation of the elite, and someone else has asked about gender. So they're all asking about the consequences of your accumulation trajectories amongst the agrarian elite for other classes in the village. Could you respond to those questions?
So very quickly, even though I focused on the trajectories of the landlords and rural capitalist households, I want to point out that this shift to wheat is actually class agnostic, in the sense that even if somebody owns 2 acres of land, they still move to cultivating wheat, and they still try and cultivate moong when they can get water. And this keeps them holding onto that small piece of land. So you don't have a story of people distress selling their land. You have the story of people renting out the land for, say, 1 season, but cultivating wheat in the other season, because they know it will be procured by the government at MSP. So in that sense, they can use their land, even if it's small, less than 2 acres. But you do find this blurring of just what is just, they're not just pure cultivators of land. They're also now working as non-farm laborers in the nearby cities. They are moving in and out of the cities to work in factories, in shops. They're also working with these large landlords who are doing other kinds of diversification. They're also employing the local village people, local lower classes, to work in non-farm sector with them. So they're also now driving tractors for somebody who owns a tractor from the village. They're trying to pick up learning how to ride a combine harvester. So it's as if accumulation is obviously taking place at the top, but you don't have stories of people trying to exit agriculture completely, because you have state support in the form of wheat. And you have very less fluctuations in yields and prices because of the availability of irrigation and MSP.
And gender?
Gender is something that I will probably have to do another study, because I could only pick up a few things because most of the work was based on asset ownership, which was combined at the household level.
Okay. Ayushman asks a question about, well, it's a complicated question, and you've answered part of it, but asks about petty production in the village, and also links it to the classification of classes. And I would like to add to that question of Ayushman's, a worry I have that our class classifications, because of the complexity of the economy, are becoming very huge. 9 classifications. Other presenters in our series have 11 or 13, because we have to admit the non-farm economy. And that number of classes exceeds our cognitive capacities to understand what's going on, unless either they are classes for politics and they have different stories, or their analytical stories are different. And I'm not sure yours are different. And I wonder whether you could comment on large-scale class classifications and the problem of coping, excuse me, the problem of coping with the complexity of the economy. But that's tagging on to this question about petty commodity production.
It is true that this kind of classification is coming from the complexities that we see around us. But I also find that there are different statistical trajectories which these classes have. So it's not as if a poor peasant household will have the same trajectory as a manual worker household, right? So there are differences at the level at which they are accumulating, but also the trajectories that they are following. And that sort of gives, that is probably one reason why I chose to do this kind of classification. And sorry, I couldn't get the question on PCP.
Does it exist? What is its importance? Is it differentiating out? Is it expanding? And we know that in all India statistics, miniaturization is proceeding apace and has been doing for a century. Differentiation theory predicts that it will disappear completely. What's going on in the village?
It's not disappearing. It is very much there. It is expanding. It is getting reconfigured as people move in search of newer opportunities to reproduce themselves. So even though they have certain income stream coming from wheat production, they are still looking at PCP as a way to bolster their income, and then in turn use that to buy another piece of land or send their children to better schools, so on and so forth. So it's very much there, and it's getting reconfigured as a process.
Of course, the Neo-Sunny Alliance will call it non-capital. I wonder whether you have a comment.
No, I think I'll pass this one.
You'll pass it. That's very wise. Jaskaran has questions basically about exchange relations and trade. What's the link of capital accumulation with non-farm sectors? But it's farm machinery, I think you've described, but food processing, which diverts our attention to trade and exchange relations. And one question there is, does the elite receive higher prices for their produce than non-elite classes in the village, and maybe preferential or subsidized prices for inputs, and therefore the structure of the cost of production is class specific?
So first I'll talk about the exchange relations very quickly, so that we don't exceed time. So for wheat, the exchange relations are completely sold to the public procurement system, except for the time, for example, when the COVID lockdown took place, there was a delay in the mandis opening and the public procurement. So that is the time when there was actually some sort of distress sale in Avli and the region itself, when people started selling to the local traders because they wanted money for their daily activities. But broadly speaking, we find that every year, everybody, they sell a small part of their produce at a lower price to the local trader, but they hold on to the majority of the produce to sell at the mandi during the procurement season. For paddy and soybean, it is usually market-based, right? So the prices are determined in the market and they keep fluctuating. For moong, again, there is public procurement in some years, and state becomes the major player then. In terms of, so even though there is, exchange relations have moved towards state playing a very important role, you do find that a small shock can destabilize the system. So a delay of about 20 days during the COVID lockdown actually then started pushing people to sell at a lower price in the village. So that time becomes very crucial then. That's the first part. And the second was about, the food processing bit. So till the time soybean was an important crop, there were soybean processing mills in the region, also in the capital city and in larger cities of Madhya Pradesh, because oil cakes and soybean cakes used to be exported. But now you see that is drying up. But a very interesting thing I would just mention briefly is to do with paddy. Now, all of us know that Madhya Pradesh does not have a GI tag for basmati. But a lot of times, companies like a lot of big companies which sell basmati rice actually procure from this region. So my respondents have sold the paddy as basmati to companies which are selling it as basmati, and we are in turn eating it. But it is coming from the fields of Madhya Pradesh, which does not have a GI tag. So they don't have processing mills per se, but they are trying to get into negotiations with. But this is again very, very restricted to certain the rural capitalist households who can afford to wait and then sell their paddy after 6 months to a large company, right? So that's one thing. But otherwise, you don't have any processing mills in the region.
Thank you very much. I think it's all right if we go on for a little while, and there are lots of questions. There are 3 questions by Anon. I don't know if it's the same Anon or whether they're different Anons, but one asks about David Harvey's accumulation by dispossession, and whether that's a force, a differentiating force in your village. And I think that relates to the fact that ABD is being evoked as a force in the capitalist differentiation of agriculture rather recently, I think. And so does that resonate with you?
Sorry, Professor Harris, right? For this, I think I will need to think about this more. So though it is a very fruitful way of thinking, at the moment, I think I would not have a comment on this.
Fine. The second anonymous question is whether non-exit from agriculture, in other words, ticking over and sticking in agriculture, is subsidized? And if so, does that reflect Kalyan Sanyal's governmentality? Is that something you would like to talk about now or think about further?
I can
I
talk
mean,
about
it's a big if there's state support enabling agriculture households from not exiting agriculture, which is rather different from capitalist accumulation, but anyway, connected with it.
I think I would just talk about the exit, but probably connect it. Again, this has to go for the future thinking bit. So the exit for agriculture that I find, and that is across classes. So it's not just that the accumulating agrarian classes or are the ones who are sticking it out in the agriculture. You also have poor peasant households which own around 2 acres or sometimes even less than that, sticking it out because of that state support. But looking into Kalyan Sanyal's work will, I think, I'll have to think about this.
The third anonymous, it's not the last set of questions, I'll come back to the last ones after this, concerns your positionality in the context of the study. I assume that anon means your positionality in the field. And if you don't mean that, could you please specify in the Q&A what you do mean by positionality? But does that resonate with you? How is it like for you to do the field work with this village?
Yeah. So this is a very difficult question. And when it's operationalized, it's even more difficult. To do a field work like this obviously requires people to talk about, rich people to talk about how they became rich. Yes. And that is a very, very difficult task, especially in India. So, and also the fact that most of the respondents are males, like the male patriarchs who were my respondents. So for them to open up to me and talk about finance itself is a huge deal, right?
Yeah.
So I did encounter some sort of, it took me a while to sort of get to the questions dealing with finances, dealing with acres and dealing with returns. So I had to generally start by just talking about the cropping pattern, the agrarian relations. I could only come to numbers towards the end. And at times I did wish that, if I was talking to women, that it would have been much easier because they were opening up very easily. But the answers were with men. So, yeah.
It is very tough to do fieldwork like this, and you're to be congratulated. The final set of questions, I think, in this very rich Q&A is, I'm going to combine Judith with Jens, who are both asking about the limits of the agrarian in different ways. How important are agrarian sources of accumulation compared to non-agrarian? And Judith is listing activities which are actually quite closely related to agrarian. And there is a case to expand the notion of the agrarian over and above production. But could you explain perhaps what you thought the agrarian was when you started your research, and whether your fieldwork and your analysis has actually tempted you to expand that conception now, or whether you think it's robust?
Yeah. So initially when I went, I just thought of coming back with answers on what they are cultivating, how they're cultivating, what is the cost of cultivation, what are they spending on? But then gradually I realized there was a lot more than the cost of cultivation or the returns from the cultivation. There was the whole, and also linking it to going beyond accumulation in agriculture. I did find cases where the agrarian, the surplus was invested in moving into input dealerships.
Yes.
So we have the same sort of households. So Sahu households that I mentioned have diversified, have now started selling pesticides in the village, right? But they don't want to leave the village and go into the city because they have large tracts of land, which also they have accumulated through this process. So you do have this kind of linkage that you have the same set of households also dabbling in input dealerships. Similarly, dairying is one thing, though it was not a very prominent thing in my study. There were a few households which actually started then doing dairying as a commercial activity. So bringing in animals again from different parts of the country and then using that to sort of generate an income stream. So these are some things that that came into the picture as I went through the fieldwork. And I would like to say that though I'm looking at the base at the households having base in agriculture, there are many other stories which are coming, which are also taking it out of the agriculture. For example, the input dealership bit, investing in machines, so on and so forth.
So perhaps a future discussion will be how one establishes boundaries as the rural economy becomes more and more complex and is more and more integrated, as you've described in your talk. Anyway, I hope I haven't done anybody an injustice. I think I've covered the gist of most of the questions in the Q&A. In which case, all I have to do now is thank you and to thank Soham very, very much for a really generative presentation and discussion afterwards. It's been really action-packed. Thank you. We will meet again towards the end of May when Shivangi Goswami is going to talk about the agrarian crisis and its impact on women, which was a seminar that collapsed for technological reasons earlier on in this series. Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you audience and questioners in the chat box, and back to the Foundation for Agrarian Studies.
Thank you, Professor Barbara. Before we wrap up, I'd like to take a moment to express our sincere gratitude. On behalf of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, I extend our heartfelt thanks to Dr. Sunit Arora for her stimulating and engaging presentation. Her work offered valuable insights and sparked a rich and meaningful discussion. We are also grateful to Dr. Soham Bhattacharya for his thoughtful reflections and for guiding today's discussion with such clarity. A warm thank you to Professor Barbara Harris-White for chairing this session and for her ongoing support in shaping this series. Her contributions have been invaluable in expanding its scope. A special thanks to the FAS online team, Sandeepan, Setu, Sai, and Tapas, for their smooth coordination and behind-the-scenes effort that made today's session run efficiently. We also acknowledge the generous support of Rosa Luxemburg Stift in South Asia, without which this series would not be possible. Finally, to all of you who joined us today, thank you for your presence and participation, which made this session all the more enriching. The recording of this session will soon be available on YouTube. To learn more about the Foundation for Agrarian Studies and our work, please visit our website at fas.org.in. We are active on social media, and you can find us at FAS Agri Studies on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I request that you follow us on these platforms to stay updated on this seminar series as well as our other initiatives. With that, we bring today's session to a close. Thank you once again for being with us.